Stanford University.
Hello, my name is Barbara Babcock. I'm a professor emerita at the Stanford Law School and will be the moderator for today's discussion of pioneering women faculty at Stanford. This event is part of the Stanford Historical Society's Oral History program. The Pioneering Women Project aims to capture the experiences of faculty members who were among the first women in their departments. What were those early days like for women? How were they initially treated by their male colleagues, students, and administration? And how did these relationships change or not over the next 50 or 60 years? Today, I will be talking with 4 of these women. Collectively, they have lived a total of 352 years. Arriving at Stanford between 1959 and 1976, they came at a time when there were very few women teachers here in any capacity. They have seen Stanford grow from a fine regional university to one of the best in the United States, indeed, in the world. At the same time as the amazing physical and financial growth, these last 50 years have seen huge social changes, and the campus has been alive with protests against the Vietnam War, with the civil rights movement, the women's liberation, and gay rights movement. Each of these women has been interviewed individually about her life and career as part of the Stanford Historical Society's Oral History program. Audio tapes and written transcripts of those interviews are available through the Stanford Historical Society's Oral History program website. I might add, as moderator, that I was the first woman faculty member hired at the Stanford Law School, and will be interviewed myself in the second session of the next generation. So now let's meet our participants. To my left is Marion Lewenstein, Professor of Communication Emerita at Stanford and Academic Secretary to the University Emerita. Before coming to Stanford, she had a distinguished 30-year career as a print journalist and was among the first to ever write stories about the start of Silicon Valley. Out of 40 women candidates, Marion was selected to become the first woman faculty member in the Department of Communication in 1976. She was 50 years old at the time and went on to become an award-winning teacher of journalism. Next to Marion is Leonore, or Lee, Herzenberg. Lee is currently a professor in the Stanford Genetics Department. She arrived at Stanford 55 years ago when she was 24 as a research assistant in her husband, Len Herzenberg's Stanford lab. Since then, she has moved up the ranks and has authored more than 450 scientific articles. She is an inventor who, as one scientist said, has left an indelible mark on the fields of immunology and cell biology. Together, she and her husband have generated hundreds of millions in royalty income for our university. Next to Lee is Nancy Packer, Professor Emerita of English at Stanford. Now retired, she is still an active and well-known writer of fiction, and she still teaches in the continuing studies program. A much beloved and very tough teacher, Nancy was director of freshman English and of Stanford's creative writing program for many years. She came to Stanford with her husband, Herb Packer, in 1958 when he was offered a job as professor in the law school. She started her Stanford career as a student in the creative writing program and ended holding an endowed chair in the English department. Eleanor Maccoby. At 97 years old, Eleanor is the Barbara Kemble Browning Professor of Psychology, Emerita. She is best known for her important contributions to developmental psychology and behavioral differences in children based on their gender. Eleanor came to Stanford in 1958 as an associate professor, recruited from Harvard, where she had been working as a lecturer and research associate. Eleanor was a highly respected psychologist nationally, being elected to the National Academy of Sciences, Institute of Medicine, and American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so now I'd like to just make some general queries of our group and go around and have each respond to them. But at any point, if somebody triggers a story that you want to tell, interrupt and tell it. So let's just have a talk like ladies over lunch. So what was it like? Why don't you each tell your story of how you came here and what Stanford was like, especially for women? And we'll start, shall we start from there maybe?
All right. The Department of Psychology at the time I came had only one woman in it, and that was the woman who ran Bing Nursery School. It wasn't Bing at the time, but it was a preschool that Stanford had. Edith Dowley, beloved in the whole community, would be the only woman's face at the faculty meeting. It was an awesome group, I felt, when I came, because these were famous people in our profession. The first issue that happened when we arrived, my husband and I are both psychologists, were both psychologists, and the question was which one of us should get an appointment in the psychology department. Why did there have to be a choice? Because at that time there was a rule that two members of a married couple could not be in the same department. That is not true any longer, but it's just one of the symptoms of the fact that things have changed a great deal. I got the nod partly because the person who had been teaching developmental psychology retired that summer when we arrived, and they needed somebody to teach the courses. My husband then went into the communication department. I found, I suppose I should say, my situation was so different than the others of you. Lee, you came as a young woman, 22, is that what they said?
24.
24. I was 40 when I got here and had a little boy aged 6 months and a little girl almost 3. I was right in the middle of the difficult years of child rearing, and so I got an appointment here as a tenured associate professor, and the first thing I did when I talked to the department chair was to say, I want to be half-time. And I was, as far as I know, the first and only tenured woman that had ever asked. There were so few of us. And from that time on, almost nobody ever asked to be half-time, but I did, and it worked out well for my family.
I came in 1958, freshly married, and I became a student in the creative writing program. And I liked it a lot. Got a fellowship in the creative writing program the second year. And the third year, Philip Roth was supposed to come to teach at Stanford, but he was had a great success with his Goodbye Columbus, and he decided not to come, and they were short-handed. So they asked me to teach. I have always been very grateful to Philip Roth. Yeah, I was a lecturer after that for 5 or 6 years. Yeah, and then all the student trouble started. My husband was sort of on the firing line, and I wanted to be at the academic council meetings. So I went to Wallace Stegner, who was my mentor and my good friend, and I said to him, I want to be on the faculty so I can go to the academic council meetings. And he said, okay. So I was. I don't think that could happen today. I don't think any individual would be as powerful today as Wally was at that point. In any case, I became an assistant professor and attended the academic council meetings, though I achieved nothing there. Then I became an associate professor and began teaching not just in the creative writing program, but in the English department for lower level courses, because I was not anything like a scholar. I taught the novel and the short story. And then I became the director of creative writing and then the director of freshman English. And by that time, I was pretty tired and I retired.
And Lee Herzenberg.
My story is totally weird compared to all of those.
But that'll make it good, yeah.
Well, I came at 24. I already had a 9-month-old and a 3-year-old at that time. And so that was fun. But we had to manage with all of that. Len came as the first faculty member in the genetics department. And I had worked in his lab when we were with Monod at the Pasteur Institute, at the so-called golden era of the Pasteur Institute, when Monod and Leboeuf were there. And that used to be a place where Monod was very welcoming of me. I don't know why. I was not quite 21, pregnant, when we arrived from Caltech. And I had no degrees at all. I had done a year of undergraduate at Brooklyn College, then Len and I got married. And when I got to Caltech, again, I don't know what they thought of me, this little Brooklyn accented kid running around, but I loved science, and I just begged to be allowed to sit in on classes, and they said, well, fine. There were no women admitted, no undergraduates, no graduate students. There was one woman postdoc in the department, and a number of women research associates who were, these days would be faculty members, but they worked, Mary Emerson worked with her husband, Marge, can't remember her last name. But in any event, there were women there who were mainly associated with husbands, except for Barbara McClintock, who came and was a major fixture in my life, because she just basically she was something other. She eventually was recognized and won the Nobel Prize and did all sorts of great things. But at that time, she was just recognized as everyone said, there were 9 professors of genetics, 8 of them listened to Barbara, and Andy Anderson was the only one who ever could speak to her. So she was great. But this was the culture in which we were brought up. There were women who were top-level scientists who were in the department. And they all went to bat for me, I think. I don't know why. I mean, I just still don't know how they picked me out or why they picked me out. Or maybe I was just the only woman young woman who ever came this way. But they gave me a job and they let me work for somebody and be a technician, although I wasn't much of one. And they let me take classes, and I took the classes, unrealizing that I was taking the undergraduate biology classes at Caltech. But there were no undergraduates in biology then. There were maybe 2 or 3. The rest, so the class was really a graduate class. It didn't faze me. I took the class, I did the work, I got my grades, I got A's in all the classes, and they gave me letters that said that I'd taken that, and I preserved those letters and eventually parlayed them into a degree. Oh. But that only took 20 years to do. So I got here, and we then went to Paris, and I went to Jacques and Monod and asked him, could I come and could I work in the lab with Len? And he took pity on me. He said, I don't think it was pity. He actually, in retrospect, he was really, recognizing and very encouraging to get into science. So there, everybody sat and had lunch. It's a very famous story that everyone had lunch in the lunchroom. There were 12 of us, or 14 at table. And lunch attendance was required at lunch. That was like the seminar that Monod and LaBeouf taught. And so I got, I ate lunch with everybody. I learned what I learned, and that turned me into the scientist I am. Then we went to the NIH, and there it was impossible for me to work with Len. No one, excuse me, no one was interested in me working with Len anyway. And I worked with Bruce Ames as a technician. I was his first technician. He should never have had me as a first technician. I should never have had him as a boss. But we got on, and we managed. And then the second child was born, and he was very happy that I said, I'm taking maternity leave. But ultimately, we did publish a very important paper together, which he recognized. So it's not a complaint with Bruce, but just that's what was. I mean, I was a pest because I wanted to know why. Or how a scientist will ask, not just do what he told me to do. And he wanted someone who would please do what I told you to do. I want to get this done. I can't blame him. I know exactly from my position where he was at. Anyway, from that, I came here intending to go find a job as somebody's technician again. And Len's lab was in chaos, and the only thing to be done, the office, it was a new department. Josh Letterberg and Esther had moved there from Wisconsin, I guess it was, and everything was in chaos. And nothing had been ordered for Len's lab. We had cultures coming, all sorts of stuff was happening. So I just I said, okay, I'll spend 3 months and work, get all this straightened out and get the lab running. And I'm still working in the lab, so that's how I got there.
Well, I got a phone call one day out of the blue asking me if I would come in and apply for a one-year lectureship at Stanford's Department of Communication. And I didn't know Stanford had a Department of Communication.
It was new.
And was absolutely unprepared for the phone call. And I said, gee, I don't have the right background for Stanford, because I, too, don't have a college degree. I guess you have now. I still don't. I had taken courses at night, but later I was told by the people who compiled my information that I would have been a junior had I stayed with the night courses. But in any case, they said, yes, they knew that I didn't have any college degrees, but would I come in and get interviewed, because I had been recommended by other people around Stanford. I'd been a reporter for quite a long time, originally for Women's Wear Daily, then for Time magazine, and with the company that produced women's wear called Fairchild Publications, started a technology paper which I ended up being the first reporter for, and that's where I got my reputation as a technology reporter. And Time hired me as a technology reporter. At any rate, I came in and was interviewed and was told they were interviewing other people and they'd get back to me. I had brought in a bunch of my material, and when about a month went by, they had told me in a week or two they would call. I didn't know the system then. Anyway, when a month or 2 months went by, I wanted my material back. So I phoned and asked, could I have my material back, assuming that they had chosen someone else. And they said, oh, well, it was down now to me and one other person. Could they please hold on to the material? I said, be my guest. And then I got a phone call from the then chairman, Lyle Nelson, who offered me the job. And feeling, I was elated and sort of wanted to get off the phone and start running around the house yelling. And, but I felt I had to be professional, so I asked what the salary would be, and he said $12,500, and I said, well, that was too low, that I expected more. And he said, well, gee, that's what we pay lecturers, and there's nothing I can do about altering that. So I demurred and finally said, well, I would accept that salary, still being on pins and needles. And I hung up the phone. My kids tell me that I then leaped up and started yelling, running around the house. any case, so I started as a lecturer in the summer of 1975, and mid-year, Lyle came to me and said there's going to be an assistant professor tenure line opening, and we would like to offer it to you. At that point, when I came in that year, they had 2 young PhD hires. One was a woman and the other a male. And I said, what about Diane and Chuck? Because it seemed more logical to me that they would offer her to that. He said the faculty had voted to ask me. And so then I had to make a decision whether to go back to time or to stick with academia. And I chose to stick with academia. The department was very welcoming. I had no problems as a woman in the department. I learned later, and I sort of was glad I hadn't known exactly at the time of the hire, that in fact the hiring process for that lectureship was going to be a woman no matter what, because one of the people, the wife of one of the people in the department, had made a fuss and threatened to sue the department because they had no women. This was Paisley's wife. The former chairman of the department, whom I talked to 2 days ago to refresh my memory, he's retired too, he says that woman never taught in the department and was a graduate student. At the time, for years, I was under the impression that she too had been a lecturer and not been offered anything beyond that. But in any case, I remained in the department and went through a whole series of title changes. I was a lecturer. Then when the offer for a permanent situation or a tenured position was made, I accepted it, at which point I think I was 50. And did the 5 or 6 years as assistant professor, and then came up for tenure, and the chair of the department and the provost, I passed tenure, and the chair of the department and the provost told me that they thought rather than go on to an assistant professor, that it made sense to, they called it a jump, to adjunct professor, and that would settle whether I had to go through any other procedures or not. And it didn't matter to me, so I said, fine. And then somewhere along the line, I was told, oh, they're going to make me professor of teaching, which is what I thought I remained at. But again, talking to my former chair, he tells me, no, that got changed to professor of communication, that I didn't have the teaching part on it. He also told me a story that I hadn't heard before, which was in turning in all the material needed for the A&P committee to judge whether I was going to get tenure or not, that some of them, the material, were profiles I had done of people in the early stages of Silicon Valley. And he not only wrote to my editors to confirm my background, but wrote to some of those people I profiled to ask what it had been like to be interviewed by me. And apparently,
Who were they?
Hewlett and Packard and Bill Noyce, Bob Noyce.
Right.
Yes. And I guess the Hewlett and Packard had been on the trustees, because apparently it turned out that some of them were trustees who wrote back, he tells me, glowing reports. So it was fun to learn that information. And then I went on doing the usual kind of teaching that one would
That is
expect.
so, this together, these stories are so different from each other, but the picture that you do get is of a school that had very, very few women anywhere in any department. Many departments had never had
But I
even
would like to
one.
say, Barbara, that it seems to me from all these stories, none of us really felt that there was prejudice against us as women. I certainly never did. Did any of you?
No,
Yes.
that's what I just said.
Yeah.
You did.
Yes,
Speak up.
not so much prejudice as indifference. that didn't assume anything from me. It was, I didn't feel that I was an equal, treated
Oh, I
as an
see.
equal. And there were very few women in the department, so it was hardly open. But although English had more women as majors and PhDs than any other department, there were still very few women teaching in the English
Okay, well,
department
that's
at
a
that
different
time.
experience than mine.
Yeah, I felt no difference one way or another, and we were a
Well, I
relatively
didn't,
small
it was,
department.
what I'm trying to say is that they were indifferent.
Yeah, I
It's
understand,
not,
but
it
what
was
I
not
meant,
that they hated me.
no, but I didn't feel the indifference, which is what I meant to say. I was asked for my opinion about many things, included in various small groups.
You were both in communication.
No, Nancy was
I was
in
in the
English.
English
but-
department
but you-
and
but you were in-
psychology.
No,
I was
her
in the
husband.
psychology
But your
department.
husband was in communication.
Yes.
So you had strengthened that department in the sense that you had
A male who-
a male who
who
was, and I think there was
More
more,
than one.
actually. There was more than one, and that department was actually very special, I think, at that time.
There was a woman in the English department before I joined it. Her name was Bailey, Marge Bailey. She was a Shakespearean. She never spoke a word to me. In all the years that we overlapped, it was total indifference. It was okay. I didn't know if she had nothing I particularly wanted to hear about.
Well, there's another side of this. As feminism grew, the question of whether you were being privileged because you were a woman, that people thought maybe you weren't quite as good as the others, but you had been let
That's what
in.
I felt after I discovered that that original group from which I had been selected were only women, and the purpose of hiring the lecturer
Yes.
was to hire a woman. And I always felt a little guilty about that, knowing some of my male friends who probably would have enjoyed having had the offer made
But
to
most
them.
of us came into the university through the back door. Not Eleanor. Eleanor came in through the front door, but I think I certainly came in through
Yeah,
the back
and
door.
obviously I
I
did.
certainly did. I certainly did.
So the back door was an easier entrance to this university.
Well,
at
I
that
began
point.
to feel like a token person when I began to be put on committees, because the number of tenured women was so few and people began to think every university committee, all university committees, should have a woman on it. And so I would be appointed to this and to that and to that. And almost every time when I went into the first meeting of a committee of that kind, who do you think I met there? Jim Gibbs. He was the only tenured black person in the anthropology department. He was. And it got to the point where we would walk into the first meeting of the committee, we'd see each other and burst out laughing. So tokenism was there.
Yeah, I added to my problems, actually. First of all, there were no women that I know of that I can remember who were appointed to the faculty, possibly Jody Goldstein, who was the wife of the chairman of
Jody,
pharmacology.
yes.
I don't remember whether Jody actually had been appointed or not, but the medical school was devoid of women.
Yes.
It was full of the men who made women jokes all over the place. These were the doctors that stood around the operating
Ouch.
table and made all these cracks. Okay, it was that way. Our department itself was a little bit different because Esther Lederberg had worked very closely with Josh, but she was a difficult person, and she certainly never had any truck for me. Partly because I had children and she wanted to. It was one of those complicated ouches. And she was just a strange woman. I liked her well enough, but it was not somebody who, in principle, she could have become a defender, but she was not. She was not on the attack for me. She just was indifferent to me, if you like. But I compounded my problems in the medical school fairly quickly in terms of being accepted there. Everybody knew me because Glenn and I ran minority programs. We started the first, I had a big, during the period 1960 to 1970, we ran a big Upward Bound type project
Good for you.
from Ravenswood High School. Andrea Stryer, Lubert Streyer's wife, and I ran that program. And that was...
Let me interrupt for a minute and
Yeah.
ask you how you, did you all just design that yourself, or what made you do that?
Oh, well, this is Len and I. I mean, Len and I lived our lives very much as two sides of one coin, okay, always. He read and I wrote. That may seem strange, but I was explaining this to somebody the other day, that we never understood how that worked, but I wrote virtually everything that ever came out of our lab. I was at least an editor on, and when it came to grant applications and all that stuff, I mean, Len had some of the finest grants in the world, but there were outstanding investigator grants, and they're based on your accomplishments, but you have to write the application. And Len would sit there, pick up the pencil, and that was the end of it. I mean, he did not ever write. And I was a writer from when I started to grow up. So I wrote, and he read. I read, of course, and of course he sometimes picked up a pencil, but rarely. He would, he'd write letters and notes, but to write manuscripts was not his thing. So, it was always that way. It was very, very, I don't know.
I'm so interested in the overlap in the stories between about having a mentor or somebody who really did help you, Lyle Nelson and Wallace Stegner in your case.
Bob Sears.
And Bob Sears, and then your husband Len, and with you, Lyle Nelson also, yeah. And that how important it was to have. There wasn't, I don't think that this Marion in 1976 looks like the communications department made a all-out sort of primitive affirmative action strike there, hiring 40 women. We won't try to have the women compete because they might not win. If we just have them compete against men, we won't have them compete against men. They'll just compete against each other, and we'll get a woman. Yeah, that's not the way affirmative action is done anymore. But it's great. But that is the first hint I get in anybody's stories of the 50s, 60s, and 70s of the university as an institution reaching out and trying to get more women or advance more women.
Nobody was interested in hiring me as a woman.
Yeah.
No one was but I really made myself, if you like, persona non grata, because I was a leader in the anti-war movement. And nobody liked me for that, and no one liked Len for that. And that was a long, long story, which is a history that probably should be dug out at some point. But definitely there was a schism that developed, because very early on, Len and I both were in the anti-war movement, but it was me, not Len. He was busy doing academic stuff. He was on study sections in Washington. But we were both very much in that movement. And before that, it was the two of us who decided that black kids had a place in school and in society, and so we built these very initial programs. When they became available from the government, Len set out to get grants for them, and we did. As I say, I wrote most of whatever went on in the family anyway. So it was really, I was in a different position. I had scientific mentors, if you like. I mean, of course, mentors, but not in the way of smoothing places for me, just people I collaborated with who took advantage of what I knew. Hugh McDevitt was a very important person at that time, and he was a collaborator with us. So later on, there was eventually somebody came in, investigated the department, and said, how come this person is publishing all these papers and has all this and is not appointed to the faculty, and said, well, we have enough, what Len does is enough for us. And somebody else apparently said to them, no, this wasn't right. And so I wound up eventually becoming first a research associate and then promoted up from that. And ultimately, when the department came into its new chain of leadership, David Botstein, Luca Cavalli-Sforza, were people who promoted me into the academic line. But to this day, I'm still an adjunct professor. That's about to change, I think. But
I thought they had done away with that title.
no, I am truly an adjunct professor. I have all the rights and privileges there. But Mike Snyder and the chairman before him and the chairman before him all always accorded me the rights and privileges, if you like. I attended faculty
but I thought the
meetings.
title itself had disappeared.
No, the title itself is, at least,
In the med school.
I tell you, it still exists. I may be the last. You may be right. We should find out.
You know, because I was academic secretary at the time they did away with that.
It wasn't quite an accident, by the way, that this push happened for people in the med school who were working in laboratories, often in their husbands' laboratories, publishing wonderful papers, doing good research, doing teaching, actually, but not getting into a faculty stream appointment. And that came up in a committee that I was a member of. In what year, I don't remember. People began to look all around the university and find how many of these so-called adjunct appointments there were for women who were very talented. And so our committee began to pressure on that. And one of the things we aimed at in particular was the medical school. And
Well, Rose Payne and Judy Poole.
Judy
were
Poole was a
older
member
than
of
I
our
am.
committee,
Was
yes.
she? Yeah.
And she was wonderful. And Dodie Goldstein was one of the first people that we took notice of. But in any case, the medical school group, Judy Poole and I don't know who else, took that over as a committee and worked there. But the same kind of thing was going on all through the university at that time to try to upgrade into an academic stream, people who should be there.
And that was a good place to start. Did
Yes.
you feel that that was part of a movement? Was that part of the feminist
Oh,
movement?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
and when did that happen?
That's what I'm trying to remember. When was Judy Poole active in
In
it?
the late 80s is my memory of it.
I was thinking it might have been earlier. The feminist movement had funny sides to it. The students gave a push to it sometimes. And do you remember, what year was it that the students occupied Encina Hall?
1972, one or two. There
One
there
or
was
two, okay. Well,
Encina was 1971.
that year, at the graduation ceremony, we were still having graduation ceremonies in Frost Amphitheater. And I remember we were all lined up, the faculty in our robes and whatnot, starting to walk up that incline, you know, that goes up so that before you go down into Frost Amphitheater. As we were walking up, here up on the hill beside us was this group of students with a long printout. They had the salaries of every faculty member in the university. And up to that time, that was a deep secret. You never asked anybody what their salary was. Nobody knew what yours was, and so on. And here they were saying, here comes Professor so-and-so in economics. He earns such and such. Do you think he's worth it? They would say to each other. And they went, after each person coming up, they would have something to say about them. Then I came up. Ah, they said, here comes the lowest paid full professor in the university. Do you think that's because she's a woman, they said. And believe it or not, I got a nice raise the next week.
I think I know who must have been there at that time. I actually saw them not so long ago. It was probably Jeannie Friedman was doing that stuff. And I will tell her this story. But see, I sat in this very peculiar place because I was part of that student movement and very much a part of it, and my friends are still part of it. So we sat on the opposite sides of a table back at that time.
Eleanor, when we were talking about how things were for women when you first came, I remember a great story you told in your oral history. Could you tell us again?
I think I know which one you mean. Sexual harassment has recently become very widespread, more widely understood than it has than it used to be. now that it's emerged as an issue in the armed forces and so on. But it's always been present sort of under the, outside of the headlights, under the radar, and in the academic world. You can see there are so many opportunities for men who want to prey upon their graduate students or undergraduate students, even their colleagues. They're usually in a position to do favors for women and to offer favors like better grades even, if people are compliant to them. So in view of the fact that people began to realize that this is an issue and that women need to be protected, the university did set up a committee, which I was a member of, where men who were accused by any of their students were brought in and talked to about it. It was a very fascinating committee to be on, you may be sure. But one of the things that struck me most strongly about it was the ego quality of these men. They found it impossible to believe that their advances were unwelcome. That had to be impressed upon them. They went out looking puzzled, not really ashamed, I think, because they didn't quite believe it, but it became clear to them that their actions were under surveillance now, and I think that did make a difference.
When I came to Stanford in 1972, it was the Troubles, as it was called. You
The
know,
Troubles,
that
yes,
the Troubles were going on, and
Just
and
about
people.
You brought peace.
Right. But people really, and I didn't see any of the actual action, but I had a sense that that the university was hurting. You know, that a lot of people's feelings had been involved, and the students and faculty had become alienated from each other, and it was, I mean, that's the way it seemed. But now, these troubles have been largely forgotten.
Not by everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I certainly remember them. You certainly remember them.
Yes, but that won't be a whole lot longer.
well,
Yeah.
in many ways, one of the things that Stanford history should do and could do would be to really deal with this history. There is a historian of the movement who's kept all the papers. We kept a library alive for a long time, and we still every year get together. And we got together this year and hear speakers and get some of the new students to come and whatever. But the point is that the history of that movement will die, and it's really too bad because it was the most powerful movement in the country. That there was Yale, and Berkeley was where it started, then Columbia. But the fact was that Stanford was the intellectual center of it. As far as I knew at the time, we were generating the documents that were the, well, it's another history, but it really should be told because we should talk about this at some point because there's a lot of stuff on this that's there. But for me, I was part of that, so I was kind of one of them, and not one of us. And this was another part of our problem. And when that committee was started, and I went to them and I said, you know, I belong with this too. And they basically said, well, we don't know what to do with you because you work with your husband, and we can't say because you work with your husband, and so we're really not interested in you. And
That's amazing to me because Dodie was very active in that whole thing, and she worked with her husband.
Dodie was the one who said that to me. I think that was a euphemism for we can't handle you, and you will hurt our movement if we really associate with you. And
And her movement was to get more women.
They were working on getting more recognition for women research at the place. But again, I didn't have any formal line of appointment. I was outside at all. I didn't have the degree. I was an anomalous woman, and it's okay. I mean, I think I just finished after 30 years. I finally, this last month, proved something that we had said that was sort of radical, if you like, in terms of immunology, and was not accepted for 1986, whatever it was that we published the first article. And we finally finished the absolute airtight nails in the coffin proof this year. But it's that kind of thing that I mean, my love is science and my love is computers because I do a lot of work with that. But it's taken me through a lot of movements, and our lab always had the reputation as the social service movement, the political radical movement, and we weren't really radical. I mean, we were in the anti-war movement, but we were not throwing stones, we were not doing anything like that. And I spent the time doing investigative reporting in the movement. We figured out who did all the violent acts that we knew about. Remember the fire that was set in the old in the horse barn?
I wasn't here, but I read about it.
There was a fire that was set there.
Well, there were some bricks thrown through the windows of the Hoover Institution.
Yes.
Well, the president's office.
President Sterling's office was burned up. Burned
Yes.
everything. He lost all of his papers.
Oh, my
because of fire.
There was one person who led most of that in the movement. That the movement did not have the sense to throw him out. I don't know why.
You're talking about Bruce Franklin?
No, definitely. We never let Bruce lead anything in the movement. This is a big fiction that went on. Bruce himself wanted to be known as the leader of this movement. We, being the people who did the leading, had meetings where we would, I hate Bruce to hear me say this, but I mean, we set up meetings where we were certain he would not be able to come. Because we did not like his brand of everything. So he did what he wanted to do. I told this story at his trial hearing because he was actually fired for something that I and a few other people organized, which was the sit-in in the thing. But he wanted to be known as the leader of that. And so at the very end of it, he got up in front of the microphone and he said, okay, let's go occupy the building. If you had a film on everybody who was walking through there, most of them were gone from that space because the occupation had already started. But Bruce was Bruce. That was another aside.
I'm curious, Nancy and Eleanor, after you joined your departments, how many more women started showing up as faculty?
Quite a lot in my department. Mm-hmm. There were maybe by 1965, 4 or 5 new women had been appointed in the English department.
When I first came in, there were no women among the assistant professors, the young people coming up ready to be asked to be kept for tenure if they turned out to be good enough. The pipeline, in other words, at that point didn't have women in it, and it began to be the case that there were women there. Now, initially, most of the women who did come in were interested in clinical psychology. Yeah. They wanted to become therapists. At that time, the psych department at Stanford taught clinical psychology. And then came the big decision where we decided not to. And we separated the clinical department away, and clinical psychology began to be taught in the medical school. And at that point then, there were fewer women in the pipeline coming to the science side of psychology, which is what the department became. But sooner or later, they began to be more numerous there, too. And I would say that their representation has become, in the psych department, at least equal.
50-50?
That's what I'm thinking of. Mm-hmm. Right about now, I believe so. I'm not sure.
It's probably true in the English department, too.
That the communication department, the PhD person who was finishing her PhD, Diana, who came in at the same time I did, continued on as an assistant professor until tenure line, and she didn't make it. And I'm realizing I don't recall that any other woman came up either as an assistant professor or at an advanced degree.
Now, I'm just thinking in the psych department, it really depends on which subfield of the discipline you are in. There are more men in the neuroscience side of our department and more women in the social science side.
Is that true in other departments, or is it just that it happened to
I
fall
think
that
it's
way
true in
here.
every department in the country, as far as I know. These are differences in interests that the two sexes have, continue to have.
Continue it at the same rate, that is to say, no changes of undergraduate majors in psychology or PhD candidates. Still, the women are
I
concentrated.
can't say still because I've been retired for these many years and
Yeah,
haven't
but
been
Eleanor, you know everything. You know.
But
What is your thought?
I'm just making the point that there remain some gender differences that have more to do with what people are interested in doing.
I'm just wondering if that has changed at all, because psychology would be a really good study of that particular question of whether or not women's interests have changed as women's opportunities have enlarged.
As their opportunities have enlarged, more and more women have gone into biology. And they'll go into biology rather than physics if they have a choice, usually, having to do with the fact that they're interested in human beings more than in math. Now, and it's still true, I believe, that women are, quote, underrepresented in math. But there's more of them coming in.
I thought from things I've read that, in fact, at the undergraduate and graduate level, particularly the graduate level, women are still sort of pushed aside, so that might explain what happens in terms of academia.
I've got to be careful to be accurate about this because I know that now women do better. I think this is true. People who are graduating from college and those who have majored in math, the women do fully as well as the men and sometimes better. So I don't want to derogate in any
That
way.
would be self-selective, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would be. But even kids graduating from high school, the girls in high school are doing as well in math or better than the average boy. But they are making choices about what to go into from then on. And
They're also not taught about the women who were leaders in mathematics throughout history. I mean, you know the names of the men. Do you know Lovelace? Do you know there are people who provided as much mathematical leadership, women, but were not talked about that way. And Helen Pauling, who was Linus Pauling's wife, told me a lot of stories like this. I at some point said, Helen, can I interview you? And I went there with my little tape recorder. I've lost the tapes. It is criminal that I lost them. Linus very much disapproved of Helen talking to me. Very, very much. But she told me a lot about the early days of physics. And she said, well, the guys, because Linus and Schrodinger and all these people would get together, Einstein, she knew Einstein quite well. And he was apparently much more forthcoming with women. But everybody says, well, he was a ladies' man. That wasn't it, I think. I think he saw people and not women. That was Helen's view. But you know, the men would go off in one room, and the women would go to another room to talk after dinner.
Yes.
And she says, "Well, I just went with the men." She says they didn't mind; they were happy if I went along with them. But and I did the same thing myself. I mean, I didn't go and sit with the women because it was more interesting
same
to
here.
me.
I know
Yeah,
what you're talking
so-
about exactly at social occasions.
That's interesting that at least three of us, and maybe four of us, at an early stage started separating ourselves off and going with the males.
The law school dean would have dinner parties, Carl Spaeth, would have dinner parties, and after dinner, the women would go in one room and the men would go in another.
That's
I
the
remember the
truth.
first time I went, I was quite shocked, but I went. I followed everybody to the women's area.
It was these kinds of things that we're all talking about now that had a big bearing on the choice of research that I finally did go into. I was beginning to be more and more irritated with some of the myths, I should say, the shibboleth things that are said about women. Women are from Venus and men are from Mars, and the one that bothered me the most was the clinical psychologist who asserted that women are by nature passive while men are active.
Oh, sure we are.
And one day a young woman walked into my office. This is Carol Jacqueline. She had just finished a PhD and she wanted a postdoc with me. We started to talk about what we would want to do. And I had a colleague in the department who was a very fierce feminist, and she had said to me, if I ever got any result in my research that might be used to the detriment of women, I should not publish it. And I talked with Carol Jacqueline about this and asked her how she felt about that. She said, I don't agree with that. The truth will make us free. And I hired her right then.
Good.
And we decided that we would we would try to put together the information that really existed on the characteristics of the two sexes. Was it true that women were more passive, or that they, all kinds of strange things had been reported about women. For example, there's a little test that is used called the prisoner's dilemma, where you have a chance to sell out your partner or not. And somebody had published a paper saying that the college women, who took this test were more likely to sell out their partners than the males were. And we took that as an example of where it was necessary to see if anybody else had found any results comparable on this issue. So we set about gathering together all the studies we could lay our hands on. And we discovered pretty soon that it was often the case that if people tested their sample on whatever they were studying and compared males and females and found no difference, they never published that. And it was only the ones that got a difference that were being published. So we got on the telephone and telephoned people that we knew had studied a certain thing. We knew they had both sexes. Had they ever compared them? What had they found? So we put these things all together into this big book called The Psychology of Sex Differences. We had each trait, like aggressiveness, on one table, all the studies that had been compared the two sexes and so on. And we found that most of the beliefs about the characteristics of the two sexes are simply myths. They were not true on the basis of all the research that had been done. A few were true. Males are more aggressive, or had been found at that time to be so. Girls were found to be more verbal in the sense that they would talk more to each other when they get together than males do. But almost nothing else came out as a significant effect, and many of the things that were widely believed were not true. So when I'm asked, did feminism influence my research? I would say certainly, because Carol Jacqueline and I would not have written that book if we hadn't already been energized about the issues. But also, I think we had a big impact on feminism. At least we became the darlings of the feminist movement because of this myth-busting book. I later wrote a book that was that showed some differences that were real, and I became much less popular with the feminists. But this was a period, I think, in a certain sense, there was a wave of feminism that it made huge changes during all of our professional lives.
And when do
Just
you
for the
think that
record,
was?
What was the book? What was the finding in the book that made you less popular?
The second book.
Yeah.
You really want to know?
Well, I think so.
Yes,
Obviously,
yes.
you're reluctant. Therefore, yes, I do.
All right. It was a study with children, all of whom were 33 months old. There were 92 little kids in this study, and they weren't quite 3 years old yet. We brought in pairs of children who had never seen each other before, and it was either two girls or two boys or a boy-girl pair. We brought in toys for them to play with. There were opportunities for things to be touched and used and whatnot in the room. And the thing that absolutely blew me away was 2 boys, the level of social interaction quite high. 2 girls, the level of social interaction higher, significantly higher, but very active, the 2 girls. Boy-girl pairs, the level of interaction down. And much of it had to do with the fact that the girl would stand back and let the boy play with whatever it was. I hated that finding, but it is true.
Could it have been size?
Being girl.
Pardon me?
It's not inherent in being girl. It just tells you that the socialization that has her stand back
There we
starts
have
much
the
earlier.
big question. What is it due to?
That's right, but it's an equally reasonable hypothesis and we know now that socialization starts that much earlier.
Oh, socialization starts early. That's absolutely
Well,
true.
what about size?
The
I mean,
girls-
boys are generally bigger.
Not at that age.
They're not?
No.
Okay, they're not
Right.
They are
nothing
stronger
more.
at that age,
stronger. Well, that might be the reason for the
where the girls.
reticence.
There are lots of there are very interesting things. You probably explored a lot of them, but
Oh, we went after that finding. I tell you, yes, we had a girl or a boy walking up a kind of sidewalk that we made on the floor of the room. Another kid standing there, and you wanted to see how close they would get to that other person. And when the girls, each sex would stop sooner if that child was the different sex. And the girls especially did not want to get closer. And then we thought, oh, it's because they know that boys are rough. And they know that that boy was rough because we first started it out, kids coming from the same classroom. So we brought in a boy they'd never seen before, and they still were hesitant to walk up close to them. This is a profound fact about childhood. And I see where your mind immediately goes, of course it's socialization, my goodness.
No. I'm just saying that you can't rule out socialization at all.
Who would want to?
I know.
Certainly
I mean,
wouldn't want to.
that's a very interesting area of
Well,
where
all
what
I'm
would go
saying
after.
is we brought this up as a very interesting area, and we were not willing to say that, of course, it was socialization.
I think that's fair.
And therefore,
You were unpopular.
you got it.
Were you really, Eleanor? I don't. That's why I want to pin down when this happened. Was this in the mid '80s? When would you say
When
that?
did you publish that book?
1973,
Oh, is
That book was
early?
1973.
The second book?
the first book.
The first
what
book.
about the
Yeah.
second?
Oh, the
yeah.
second one was much later, 1990,
90.
I think.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
I don't think it was that late.
No, it wasn't. It was 83. I'm thinking of a different book. Yeah.
Because I remember you and I having a discussion. You didn't like my interpretation. Said, all you media people.
Well, I want to see what when the troubles at Stanford or the effects of the anti-war movement, and then that passed and sort of melded into the civil rights movement.
No, it actually was the other way around. That the civil rights movement began before the anti-war movement, and that there was a
Yes,
big
right.
argument about whether the two should merge, and there was a very strong feeling in each case that the other thing would be politically unhandleable, and so it ultimately, ultimately they merged, we merged, whatever. But there was a big discussion about that
Well,
at
the
the time.
three movements, civil rights, anti-war, and feminism.
Feminism.
Now, when was the feminism at full?
Well, when I
Force.
joined Stanford in the summer of '75, there was a group, I think Elizabeth Cohn from
Yes.
sociology was leading informally, and I guess you were part of it. And we used to meet outside of Jordan Hall. For some reason, we'd meet at lunchtime outside. And that, I think, was the beginning group. I don't know whether you were also part of it, Nancy, then. And then it got more formalized, and eventually, of course, ended up as the gender
Yeah.
studies.
The,
When was that?
75, the summer of '75. It might have started before then, but
the Center for Research on Women and Gender was the first of those groups to be formally,
yeah, that's what it.
and that happened because Myra Strober in
Oh, that's
the
right,
School
Myra
of
Strober.
Education came over to interview me with two other students, and they said they wanted to raise some money to create this organization, and they needed a tenured faculty name on this for their application, and they got me and Jim March, and the two of us signed for it. And we certainly did not take leadership of the organization once it happened. Well, all we did was help raise the money for it. But that has...
That's a lot.
Yes.
Jim Marsh, what department was he in?
He was in 3 departments.
Oh,
Business,
remember him.
education.
Political science.
Yes, right.
He was a big name on
Yeah,
campus.
I know the name, but I don't
he was-
remember
he was
his
quite
being
a figure.
involved.
He was a very interesting guy. So that morphed into the Institute
I
for,
think so.
Then it was the Institute for Research on Women and Gender for a while,
Well-
Earwig, and then it was, and now it's
yes.
the Clayman Institute, which is
yes, that's
really
right.
kind of fabulous.
It's what?
The Clayman Institute. That's Old Crow. Did you know that? Did you
No,
realize
I didn't realize that. No.
Yeah, and
Those,
it's,
those acronyms, I know.
It was Old Crow.
well, it used to be the Center for Research on Women. We came very close to calling it the Center on Women, which would have been a mistake.
That would have been cow.
But the cow, right.
But then we
got-
thought that Crow wasn't very good
I
either.
thought Crow was good.
I
you
did
know.
too.
Great.
Crow is
Yeah.
actually very bad for a different reason, that there was a group of generals during the Vietnam era who called themselves the Crows, or the Old Crows.
Oh.
And in fact, there was a bunch of kids who formed a movement, I think it was 1973, who formed a committee called the Young Crows to go after the
Oh,
Old
I
Crows.
see. I didn't know about that.
But
At
they
the
were
time, I
still
liked
crows.
it because I didn't think Earwig was any better.
Well, I don't think Earwig was very good.
I know. I thought it was ridiculous.
I would
but-
tell you that there was, during the anti-war movement, there was a strong feminist. I mean, this was, again, the men were leading this movement, but there were some very, very strong women. I mean, I was older than most of them, so, you know, I kind of sat back as the faculty. I'm used to make chicken soup for everybody, the faculty mother, whatever. But of the young women, some of them really, Margie Cohn is probably best known, and she's
Who was?
Marjorie Cohn, who was one of the, and there was a lot of discussion in the coordinating committees about how to, you know, get more strength given to the women, and the women were asking for it. Most of the men felt it ought to happen, but there was still major gender. I mean, we all came from a generation where the women knew their place. So this was breaking all these new kinds of barriers to women. I think those women are around. They're very interesting. So I say it would be fun to actually talk about the history of that movement, because that places it very cleanly between 1969 and 71 or 72. And then they went on to do the rest of their stuff. From a historical point, the discussions in that coordinating committee are really worth recalling.
No, it is the 70s, and was when it seems to me that the university began to take, have concern and take an interest in getting more women and in advancing them.
Well, I think Dick Lyman, as the provost, was very instrumental in opening a lot of doors for women.
Yeah.
His wife was a feminist. She didn't have a position here at the university, but she was a leader of some substance. She was.
Jane Lyman.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
was a very
Oh,
tall
you bet
woman.
she was.
I think she played a role. Estelle Friedman from history and I, it turned out, had been hired at the same time. And I don't remember, it must have been after I became assistant professor. Jing Lyman had a luncheon at Estelle. That was where I met Estelle. And there were 4 maybe other people. And it wasn't until later that I realized that she was pushing the women by sort of getting them acquainted with each other and giving them a method for trying to put something together and go forward.
Well, so do any of you all have stories or remembrances of the women's movement being a help to you or an influence on you, or vice versa?
Well, it obviously helped us all in that it must have smoothed the way for us to to progress at this university. Not in a specific way, but obviously it opened things for us. I have to say, I'm going to take a contrarian view here for a minute.
You?
Okay, I was disturbed a bit at the beginning by the feminist movement. I thought that it was knocking the civil rights interests away, and I thought that, and I think it did make for less interest in civil rights. So I thought, we don't have it so bad, us women. I felt that. Of course, I was lucky, so it was all right for me to say. But I felt that it did, in some ways, interfere with the civil rights movement. The same way that I thought the student movement, the anti-war movement, interfered with the civil rights movement. But then that was followed by the feminist movement, and we really haven't really recovered the impetus that we had in the civil rights movement, I think, since that time.
Since this, you mean the civil rights movement hasn't recovered?
Since the feminists, the anti-war, and things were really going well in the early 60s, I thought. I also went over and tutored in East Palo Alto, and a lot of people did. It was people were really active, really concerned, and then it sort of died away.
But you think, in a sense, that
It's hard to sustain three movements at the same time.
right, yeah.
I'm not sure that they should be separate, though. I mean, I think the problem, I grew up in a situation, because Len was who he was and believed as he believed, he really did not see black, white, women, not women. His feeling, we trained, if we look at the people who came through our lab, the women who came through our lab, they were, one of them became the top woman in immunology in England. Pat Jones trained in our lab. There was a woman named Hannah Laster, who became the Berlin High Commissioner for AIDS. A couple of Amherst professor of UMass. I mean, Len's belief was very clearly that if he brought someone into the lab and that person did training there, he was not going to see them not have an equal position to the men who were in the lab. And so I grew up in an environment where women and men were treated equally, that we fought out all our battles. Len and I were well known to have battles over whether this cell or that cell was the right cell at a lab meeting. I was never known to hold my peace in any particular way. But Len really made the difference. So we had immunology and microbiology, had the same group of interested people, the same group of students. But Len made the difference because he was chairing a lot of the meetings. And he just kept asking, well, where are the women on this program? Oh, there are no competent women. Oh, I see. Well, how about? And he knew all of the women. So he did that kind of feminist job that was being done, and it was done by a man. I mean, it didn't have to be done by a woman. It just had to be done by somebody who would be equally interested in the fact that women are being put down and narrowed. And my own feeling was that I really disliked the feminist movement for its concept of we need to have women discussion groups. Oh, yes. None of us would shut our mouths I don't know, I can't speak about you, but I would say generally speaking, we were not going to not talk in meetings where there were men present. And so why were we training young women to think that the only way they could speak their minds was in fact to be in meetings where they themselves were all this. I mean, it's weird. One woman once came up to me and said, "Did you realize that you were in that meeting with 14 men?" And I thought about it and I said, "Yeah, you're right." I mean, it never occurred to me. And my students and the people I've taught for it not to occur to you. Not to keep looking at whether there's a man or a woman and whether you should be speaking in the presence of men. And I think the women's movement made a huge mistake in trying to do that. And it was one of the reasons I never really joined into that movement, because I thought it was retrograde.
Well, you didn't have to do consciousness raising to be a member of the movement,
Yeah,
I
don't
think.
remember being restricted.
Well,
Yeah.
no. I'm talking of one particular aspect of it, which was very strong years ago.
Yeah.
Which was this feeling that you had to have groups in which only women were present because, and many of the women who were in those groups told me, I don't feel comfortable speaking when there are men.
Oh, gosh.
And, but they did, they told me this, and this was, very much backed by the women's movement at that time. It's probably, it's a relic, an antique. But it was the thing that women were being told by the women's movement. And it was why I really did not join into the whole group when it was starting in the 70s. I mean, I couldn't be part of that.
Could I just confess another kind of discomfort about the feminist movement? And here I think you're going to disagree with me, Lee. But I think of the academic world as that it should be a meritocracy. And I remember feeling strongly that if we wanted to get more women into academic jobs, what we should do is get them in at the entry level, get more women in the pipeline to see what they could do. But when it came to the tenure decision, I certainly didn't feel that we should give any preference to women because they were women.
I agree with you thoroughly.
That's
part of what I'm saying here is that I think that the whole concept, it hurts women for them to be in a position where you're being told, well, you got your job because you're a woman. I mean,
Good.
that's
All
an
right,
easy
then
way
we're in
for the men
agreement.
They're
to
going to be,
feel.
that's going to
Yeah.
happen though, anyway, whether that was the truth or not, I think.
Well, that's true. It was going to
Yeah.
happen, but we needed to stop it, not
Not encouraging.
Barbara first came
encouraging.
to the law school, some of the, my husband was a law professor, so I was aware of Barbara's pioneering. Some of the men in the law school said women are plenty smart, but they don't have the cutting edge.
That's what the surgeon said in the medical
Yeah,
school.
well, that's pretty good, yeah.
I'm sorry,
But
couldn't resist.
that women did not, they lacked the cutting edge. But I think that the law school, after you'd been there 6 months or so, had changed its mind.
The law school had, no, it was really, it was, I've just been writing my recollections and looking back on those days, but I was the only woman for 5 years. And it was not, and it was very strange, and the students would say to me, how can you stand it in those meetings with all those white men? And I thought, I've spent my whole life with white men, But there was, the sense that that we all benefited from the movement. Now, I much more directly, because it was really the movement that brought me to this wonderful job at the law schools. All of a sudden, the law schools had a tremendous.
What year was that, Barbara?
That was 1972, but it was early 70s, and most law schools were like Stanford and had never hired a single woman,
No
not
cutting
one.
edge.
Though many women had.
Wow.
That's it. Had graduated from the law school, so there were plenty of qualified women. But it all did.
There was a woman who was president of the law review that they,
Brooksley
Bourne, that
Brooksley.
she doesn't have the cutting edge.
She doesn't have the cutting edge. Yeah, she was just
She's
kind of
smart.
quiet.
She's smart.
Yeah,
She memorizes really well.
She was the one. She was the head of the commodities future, I think, and she went up against the men who got us into the crisis in 2008, and kept
She was
saying
absolutely right.
Yeah, she
and
was
they-
absolutely
they
right, and they
dominated her.
yeah.
It was terrible.
It really
They
was.
fired her essentially.
Yeah, they essentially fired her, but she.
But I remember that they would say she doesn't have the cutting edge.
That is the true. And the uneasy relationship between the women's movement and civil rights comes out partly, I think, because there was a real push to hire women, and the thought that if we could get women, we won't have to hire any minorities, or we won't have to be pushed to hire minorities.
That's what you're saying.
That's what, Barbara's just supporting me.
Yes, no, that
unusual.
and so that was part of it, and then of course that there's always been this problem. The law schools and many other parts of the university were really white male enclaves, and that has changed. I mean, that has really changed, and I think the women's movement had a lot to do with it. But it was all starting in your time, I think, so that you all are the truly pioneering. See if there's anything else that you wanted to say about the effect of the women's movement on your own career or your contributions to it. If that is, Eleanor might still be an icon of the feminist movement. Do you think your iconic statue
I'll take the
has
Fifth
been
Amendment
decreased?
on that.
Yeah.
I think the movement has changed, and it has become more possible for women to recognize that the two sexes may have somewhat different life careers trajectories. The fact that we're the ones who give birth and men don't, it makes a difference.
It's got to make a difference.
It makes a big difference. And so then you come up against all the big issues for women becoming professionals. I think Betty Friedan was absolutely right when we got to the point of having small families and all the luxurious kinds of appliances we had in keeping house. It was boring to live a life of doing nothing except raise young children. They grew up, and there you were without a career and so on. People have had to find their way around that, all the issues. Should I have my children while I'm young and then go into graduate school? Or should I do the hard professional work early and get established and then have the children? We've done it in different directions, haven't we, the group right here? Because I had my children very late, and you had yours very early.
I had mine very early. But Len, again, he was this amazing character. I wish he were here to tell you his stories himself. But Len, I work from 10 a.m. until 2 or 3 a.m. That's my normal waking hours. Len worked from 6 a.m. to, he basically was into a book by 10 or 11 o'clock at night, unless I kept him up because there was something going on. So we had these two easy overlapping times, but each of us had time to ourselves that happened at those times. As a result, he always got up and gave the kids breakfast. And I would wake up, and take care of them until 3 or 4 in the morning. And then if they cried or something, he would wake up and take over. And this was just a natural rhythm between us. But he wanted that kept a secret. He did not want people to know about it in the early years. And then, when it began to be fashionable amongst the younger men to say that I'm helping to take care, I'm sharing childcare, all of a sudden Len blossomed as a flower. He was terribly happy to tell everyone that he shared in the childcare. And the younger families now share in childcare. I mean, it may be that the woman bears the child, but very shortly thereafter, you find Dad with the child carrier. And he's really happy to feel that baby right here. And
well, the
like
fathers have increased their percentage of time of child care time that's divided between them from 5% to 15%. That's
average,
wonderful,
but there's a lot,
it's the women who are still doing it, is my point.
I think that's probably true, but amongst the ones that I know, of kids I know
Well,
from
in the
this
academic
generation.
world, I think you probably do get something closer to equality. I'm thinking
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, when my children were so young, I've already mentioned the fact that I went to half-time for a while. That was only 3 years. Then I went to 2/3, 3/4, just so I could be there when the kids got home from school and so on. I'd put them to bed, and they would be asleep by, say, 9 o'clock. I went to bed immediately, woke up every morning at 2 o'clock, and worked for 2 hours on the next day's lecture, from 2 to 4 regularly, and then went to sleep and slept until breakfast time. My husband got up and got breakfast. I did that for 25 years.
To answer, or to shift the conversation a bit, Barbara had asked where we thought we'd made a difference on the feminist movement for others. And in my case, it had to do with students. Entering the journalism field until very recently was heavily dominated by males, and women were usually kept to the fashion pages. They didn't go up the ladder to be managing editors. And because I was in the department and worked to help students get their first jobs and pushed the women students to not step back, I think over time I did make a difference on many women, young
I
women.
think you did.
Yeah, that sounds like it. Seems like it's
Yes.
true. Were you active with Crow too from your
I was
beginning?
not terribly active. I attended the meetings a lot. I suppose I did a few things, but I don't remember specifically. But the beginnings of that I referred to before, where people were meeting informally under Elizabeth Cohn's kind of aegis in the area where the communication department then was, which is now where the computer science is, or Jordan.
Political science and
The Jordan Hall area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where the law school used to be too.
That's
when I
right.
first came. Yeah. No. Do you have anything to add on that, Nancy, in terms of what you feel might have been your contribution to the movement, or to
That's
the
embarrassing. I don't think I had much of a contribution.
Well,
to the
by having
movement.
having a successful
Just
career and all
having a
you've written.
successful career, I
Yeah.
guess, is some
Yeah.
contribution.
That's a big
But in terms
contribution.
of active participation, I didn't have much. Sorry,
No.
you shouldn't have embarrassed me.
I'm sorry. I take it back. But no, I do. I think what you said is the truth, that we all benefited from the movement and gave back to it by
By
being
doing
big
well enough,
successes.
by
Yeah.
doing well enough, you
Yes.
contributed to the advancement of the
That's
movement.
it. No,
That's the point.
And I think you always feel, being a pioneer, that you carry the whole sex on your shoulders. I mean, if you say something stupid,
It's because you're
it
a
hurts
woman.
more than you yourself, and that's why I never spoke in meetings. See, just because I didn't want to take any chances. Yeah, that women would be hurt. And now that we have so many women, it doesn't matter. And I do think we're coming really in many parts of the university to the place, the meritocracy, where it's the sex, the race don't matter.
We're certainly moving in that direction.
I think we are.
Yeah. I want to do.
Women who become chairman of their departments, I think, have helped a lot. I know geology was fairly early on having a woman as head of
Lucy
the
Shapiro
department.
is a
And,
very,
yeah,
very
Lucy's-
important moving power feature in the medical school, and that's been a long time that's been true. And there are several other women, Minx Fuller. I mean, we have a number of strong, very strong, powerful women. I mean, I live in a really different environment because there was not, or at least we were protected against by some of these guys from feeling the full brunt of sitting on our heads. But there was still the same thing. I mean, the issue was really basically getting the women to feel that they were empowered, getting the next generation coming in to feel like there is an alleyway for me. And I was going to tell a story a minute ago because there are two fields, microbiology and immunology. And one day at Asilomar, microbiology was moving out and immunology was moving in as a meeting. And Len, as I said, had made a point of seeing to it that women were represented on programs, that women came to the meetings, that women got postdocs, and we trained a number of the leaders in this area. And so we came in, and they looked. One of the guys came up to me and he said, "How come you guys have so many women in your field and we don't have any at the meeting?" and the answer really is very much this question of somebody has to blaze this. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we need to believe it's women or men. I think we need to believe it's people. And I've always been very much this people person, you be what you are. And that's, Len, I don't know which one of us made the other one like that. We couldn't ever say ourselves. But that was, I think, to the answer of women, of why women perform. I mean, there's no difference in these two fields in terms of intellectual performance. There was just the question of how the field was going to look at the people and how the women were going to be perceived and whether they felt comfortable standing up and making an argument against what was on the blackboard or agreeing with it or whatever. And that was it was a very interesting test area. Again, if somebody wanted to do research, that would probably be a way to go after it. I don't have any real data except that one funny comment.
That's great. Well, let's. I think we're reaching the end here, and let's conclude maybe with what advice you might give to young people, young women, about their future at this point. Or any other thing you want to talk about.
Latest movie.
I had dinner last night with somebody's granddaughter who has just been hired by Google. I was so impressed with how unimportant all the issues we've been talking about would be to her. They'd simply take it for granted that they're going to compete for this job just with men or women, it doesn't matter. I think they really believe their gender has nothing to do with whether they were hired or not. And I find this so refreshing.
What's interesting is how many of the heads of these computer companies are women. Yahoo, I can't just offhand say who they are, but there are about 4 that are head of the computer companies, the CEOs.
But that's still a very small number compared to
well, not
the number.
in terms of the computer companies.
No, it is in terms of the computer companies also. There's
sorry,
a whole,
I guess I'm
there
wrong.
is, Nancy, I'm sorry. No, there is a whole culture now discussing this, that there's a boys' culture inside these computer and engineering and the technology companies. And it's as bad as the boys' culture was in microbiology, if you like. And
that's right.
the women get in, they get good jobs, they get much better jobs in marketing and in public-facing jobs. In the engineering, the women still have to fight their way. And I've got a student now who's going to turn them all upside down. She's a Russian woman who managed to get here from Siberia. And she's phenomenal. She's a mathematician. And boy, she went to the last meeting and she got up at the microphone and she was telling these guys what she's right. But the thing about her is that she was a model in Russia. She's gorgeous. She's tall, skinny, everything you could expect. So I guess my comment is that the younger generation is really where it is coming from.
Let me
It's
ask
great.
you, there are a number of women who are heads of computer companies that we know of. I mean, the computer companies we've heard of. But there are lots more computer companies, engineers, and I'm wondering if what you suggested isn't true, that the companies eventually are no longer just engineer-driven, as some of them are. When they begin, they all are when they begin. Not engineer-driven, but business-driven or management-driven, and that's when the women can have some leadership. Does that support what you're saying? Lee?
To some extent,
Well, no, what I'm saying is that women will be engineers. I mean, Daria is one of my examples, but there are young women engineers now who are just going to come in there and, no, move over, I'm as good as you are, and you know, I need a place here, and they will get in. I think it's an evolution, like everything else. It's an evolution, and then they will get in.
One of the reasons Marissa Mayer, who's now head of Yahoo, went to Yahoo is because she couldn't go up the ladder at Google.
But who's head of Google? No, there's a man.
Two men, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And there are just so many, you're referring to them as computer companies, technology companies.
I should say technology.
That exist out there without women in any management position.
Yeah, but I have to say that Becton Dickinson, which makes the cell sorter that Len and I have worked on, has now, in the last year, brought in a president for the local BDIS unit, which is it's a $1.3 billion or $2 billion unit, and Claude is now the president of this. And they, for a long time, had a woman driving their business development. And now they tell me they've just brought in 2 other women. So all of a sudden, this very major medical technology company is now being led by a majority of women. They have one head of engineering, and he's happy to be with these women. But they had a woman in there before who prevented all this from happening, and who was a very bad technologist and almost dumped the whole company with the way she. So women did the good stuff, women did the bad stuff. You know, it's good. We're people.
Yeah.
No. And anything else on advice you might give young people, or?
Go where their heart is my advice.
Yeah.
Become an engineer.
Become an engineer, right.
There's a lot of openings there for sure.
I was asked recently at a meeting what advice what courses I would advise a young person who was interested in journalism, what they should take. And I said computer science. And everybody laughed. They thought I was kidding. I was dead serious.
Of course, absolutely, of course. Can I end with a very funny story that I promised I was going to tell?
Oh, good.
Today?
Okay, good.
And it sort of is the ridiculous to the sublime again. Back when we had in our lab 3 women, me, a woman named Johanna Lajster, whom I mentioned became the High Commissioner for HIV in Germany, and another woman named Ethel Jacobson. And Johanna was a stunningly beautiful woman. I mean, by anybody's criteria, she still is. And she would have cells to count, and she'd have to count them at what we called a Coulter counter, which was this counter, and it was up on a high counter, and you sat on a chair, and she sat on the chair with her legs crossed, and so that she could balance herself and fed the machine. And it turned out that at that time, it was really not right to wear jeans or pants to the lab. You wore a skirt. You got home, immediately you threw off the skirt, put your jeans on, and went and did whatever you wanted to do. But we were not allowed to wear jeans to the lab. And so Johanna was very, very embarrassed. She's very light-colored, and she would be red-faced because she'd sit on that chair with those gorgeous long legs. And we wore mini skirts at that time. You didn't wear longer skirts. So she was kind of spending her time between feeding the thing and pulling her skirt down. And men used to collect at the door and stare in. Oh. And finally, Johanna and Ethel came to me and they said, "What are we going to do about this?" They're just, people just come there to stare at Johanna. So we said, all right, we're making a unilateral decision. From now on, we wear pants to the lab. And that started, that was the first pants people wearing in the medical school, as far as I know. But it took doing it to do that, and it was really comical, and we still sometimes talk about it. Just recognize that
has been part of the revolution.
Huge evolution.
In fact, it used to be when I started out, you couldn't wear pants to court, and the legal thing, and we had a little law firm, Equal Rights Advocates, and we kept a one-size-fits-all dress there in case somebody had to go to court, so that they could put on the dress.
Women were not teaching in pants when I first came.
Not at all.
And I was the first one, I think, to teach in a pantsuit, and that would have been 1959.
I guess in '75, I was still wearing a skirt to class.
Were you really?
Yeah, I've got a picture that I happened to notice recently, and I'm wearing a jacket and skirt.
That would be unusual for you.
Yes.
No, well, I think we're all in agreement that times have changed and for the better, and thank you all for the part that you played in it. So you're my,
yourself.
I'm the next generation, and I
here's
feel
more
that
change,
I've
right?
always felt that I stood on shoulders of people like you. So, thank you.
Giants. Giants.
Giants.
On the shoulders of giants. That's what Newton said.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Aren't we giantesses?
In explaining his success, he said, I stood on the shoulder of giants.
Yes.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.